The second hour passed, and Yuna's knees had gone numb against the broken stone, but she did not shift her position or show any sign of discomfort. The cub had lowered her paws completely now, and both amber eyes watched the human with an intensity that seemed too old for such a young face. Yuna had begun talking sometime during the first hour, and she spoke about nothing important and everything ordinary. "There is a river near my home on Earth," she said in that same soft voice she had used from the beginning, and her words came slow and gentle like water over smooth stones. "My niece Mina likes to collect rocks from the riverbank, and she has jars full of them in her room, and each one has a story she made up about where it came from." The cub's ears had rotated forward without the child seeming to notice, and that small movement told Yuna more than any words could have. "Mina is about your age, I think, and she believes that every stone remembers something from long ago. And if you listen carefully, you can hear what the stone wants to tell you." A tiny sound came from the gap in the rubble, and it took Yuna a moment to realize it was the cub trying to speak. The word that emerged was rough and broken from hours of silence and fear. "Why?" Yuna tilted her head slightly and kept her hands resting on her own knees where the cub could see them clearly. "Why, what little one? Why do you wait?" The question carried so much weight for such a small word, and Yuna felt her heart tighten at the confusion and suspicion and desperate need for an answer that she could hear beneath it. "Because you are scared," Yuna said simply, and she did not look away from those watching eyes. "Because someone hurt you, and now you think everyone will hurt you, and the only way I can show you that is not true is to wait until you believe me." The cub was silent for a long moment, and her ears twitched back and forth as she processed this answer. "The ones who came," the cub said, and her voice trembled on each word, like she was walking across thin ice that might break at any moment. "They did not wait, and they did not ask, and they just—" She stopped and could not finish, and Yuna did not push her to continue. "I know," Yuna said, and those two words carried all the sorrow she felt for this child and for this world and for every world the Keth had touched with their cruelty. "I know what they did, and I know why you are afraid, and I am not them." She took a slow breath and spoke the next words with careful weight because she understood that they would matter. "My name is Yuna, and I make you a promise right now in this moment, and I give you my word." The cub's eyes widened slightly at that phrase, and Yuna continued, "I will not touch you until you tell me I can, and I will not leave you until you are safe, and this is my word, and I do not break my word." Something flickered across the cub's face, and it might have been confusion, or it might have been the first spark of something like hope. "Your word," the cub repeated slowly, and her voice made the phrase sound strange and foreign. "Among my people, that is a promise that cannot be broken," Yuna explained, and she kept her tone steady and calm and certain. "When a human gives their word, it binds them, and it means they would rather suffer harm themselves than break what they have sworn." The cub stared at her for a long moment, and Yuna could almost see the child's mind working through this concept and trying to fit it into a world that had shown her only broken promises and shattered trust. "My mother made a promise," the cub whispered, and her voice cracked on the word mother. "She said she would keep me safe, and she put herself between me and them, and they—" The words stopped again, and Yuna felt tears prick at her own eyes, though she did not let them fall. "Your mother kept her promise," Yuna said softly, and there was no question in her voice because she knew what the cub was telling her. "She kept you safe, and she did not break her word." The cub made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, and her small body shook. Once before going still again, footsteps approached from behind, and Commander Torvik's voice cut through the fragile moment like a blade. "Sergeant Park, this is taking too long, and we have reports of more survivors in the northern sector, and I need your team mobile now." His voice was loud and frustrated, and Yuna heard the cub gasp and saw her press back against the stone as fear flooded those amber eyes once more. Yuna rose to her feet in one smooth motion and turned to face the commander, and put her body between him and the opening where the cub hid. "Lower your voice," she said, and her tone had changed from soft and gentle to something that carried an edge of steel beneath. The calm surface Darvik's ears flattened and his eyes narrowed at being addressed that way by a human. "You do not give me orders," he said, and his voice was still too loud. "I am not giving you orders," Yuna replied, and she did not step back from his greater height. "I am telling you that there is a child behind me who is just beginning to feel safe, and your shouting has undone an hour of work, and if you care about your people the way I think you do, then you will speak quietly and give me the time I need." The commander stared at her, and Yuna held his gaze without fear or aggression, but also without backing down. Something passed between them in that moment, and Yuna did not know if it was respect or anger or simply recognition of someone who would not be moved. Torvik's ears slowly rose back to their normal position, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower. "How much time?" "As much as she needs," Yuna said, and she meant every word. The commander looked past her to the gap in the rubble, where two amber eyes watched this exchange with something that might have been wonder. A human had stood between her and a raised voice, and the human had not flinched. Torvik nodded once and turned away, and his footsteps faded back toward the other teams. Yuna knelt again in the same spot she had occupied before and looked at the cub with a small smile. "I'm sorry about that," she said, and her voice had returned to its gentle tone. "He's worried about his people, and sometimes worry makes us loud." The cub was quiet for several heartbeats, and then she spoke. The words that Yuna had been waiting to hear without knowing she was waiting. "What is your name again?" "Yuna," she answered, and felt something warm bloom in her chest. "I am called Ri," the cub said, and her voice was still small and afraid, but it was also the first time she had offered anything freely. "Hello, Ri," Yuna said, and she smiled again and kept her hand still and waited because she had given her word and she would not break it. 3 months had passed since the day Yuna knelt in the rubble and gave her word to a frightened cub. The refugee processing center on Way Station 7 was bright and clean and filled with Velrini families preparing to start new lives on new worlds. Far from the ashes of Threshold 7, Ri stood beside Yuna in the departure hall, and her small paw was wrapped around Yuna's fingers the way it had been so many times over the past months. The cub had grown in ways that could not be measured. By height or weight, she spoke more now, and laughed sometimes, and had begun to draw pictures that showed things other than falling buildings and fire. Dr. So Jin Kang had helped her find words for the feelings she carried, and had taught her that grief was not something to be locked away, but something to be held gently and allowed to change over Timuri's extended family waited near the transport gate, and they were good people who had traveled far to collect this last piece of a family. They lost, and they looked at Ri with love and hope and patience, but Ri was not looking at them. "Do you have to go?" she asked, and her voice was steady because she already knew the answer. Yuna knelt one final time and brought herself to eye level with the cub, who had changed her in ways she was still discovering. "There are other worlds that need help," she said gently. "Other cubs who are scared and hiding and who need someone to wait for them. Like you waited for me." "Yes." Ray's ears twitched, and her amber eyes were bright, but she did not cry because Velrini children were taught to hold their emotions close, and some lessons were harder to unlearn than others. "Is your word finished now?" Ri asked. Yuna tilted her head and considered the question carefully. "My word was to stay until you were safe, and to show you that raised hands can also heal, and that strangers are not always enemies." She reached out slowly, and Ri did not flinch, and Yuna gently touched the soft fur of the cub's cheek. "Do you believe those things now?" Ri nodded slowly. "I believe them because you showed me. Then my word is complete." They stood in silence for a moment, and the noise of the station moved around. them like water around stones, and neither of them wanted to say what came next. Commander. Torvik approached, and he moved differently than he had 3 months ago, and there was a softness in his posture that had not been there before. Sergeant Park, he said formally, and his voice carried the weight of ceremony. Before you depart, I must perform a ritual that my people reserve for moments of great significance. Una stood and faced him and did not know what to expect. Torvik raised one paw and pressed it flat against his chest above his heart, and then extended it toward Una with the palm facing up. By this gesture, I bind my people to yours with a debt of service equal to what you have given, and this debt will be remembered, and this debt will be honored, and until it is repaid, the Vorani stand with humanity in all things. He held the pose, and Una realized he was waiting for some response, though she did not know the proper form. She did what felt right. She pressed her own hand against her heart, and then extended it to meet his with her palm facing down. Their hands touched briefly, and Torvik's ears rose high in what Una had learned was an expression of approval. You understand more than you know, he said quietly. He stepped back and nodded once and walked away, and Una knew she would probably never see him again. But she also knew that something had passed between their peoples in that moment that would echo through years. She would never. Witnessry tugged at her sleeve. I have something for you. The cub reached into the small bag she carried and pulled out a stone that was rough and gray and covered with the dust of a world that no longer existed. I found it in the rubble of my home on the day you found me, and I kept it because my brother liked to collect stones the way your niece does. She pressed it into Una's palm. From Mina. And you can tell her that this stone came from very far away, and that it remembers a family who loved each other very much. Una closed her fingers around the stone and felt its weight, and felt the tears threatening to fall. Thank you, Ree. Thank you, Una. They embraced one final time, and Una breathed in the scent of amber fur and clean soap and something that might have been hope. And then she let go, because holding on forever was not the same as keeping someone safe. Walked toward her waiting family and stopped at the gate and turned back one last time. I will remember, she called across the distance. I will remember that a human knelt in the dust and gave her word and kept it. Una raised her hand, and this time Ree did not flinch and did not cower, and instead raised her own small paw in a mirror of the gesture. Raised hand could mean many things, and now Ree knew that Una stood in the departure hall until the transport was gone, and then she walked to her own gate where her orders waited and another world needed her help. She held the stone in her pocket and thought about rivers and nieces and the strange paths that life could take years later when the histories were written and scholars tried to understand how the alliance between humans and Varani had grown so strong they would find a document in the Velrani archives that attempted to explain. The document spoke of relief efforts and cultural exchange and political agreements, but the closing line said something different. We thought humans were warriors because they could kill, but we learned they were warriors because they could kneel, and we thought their strength was in their hands, but we learned it was in their word. And we thought they came to save our bodies, but they saved something far more precious, and we will not forget. Una never read that document because she did not need to. She already knew that the most important battles were fought without weapons, and the greatest victories were won in the space between a raised hand and a kept promise. She carried the stone with her for the rest of her life, and sometimes late at night when the universe felt too large and too cold, she would hold it in her palm and remember a frightened cub in the ruins of a broken world, and she would remember that she had knelt and given her word, and that her word had been enough. That was the human way that had always been the human way, and somewhere out among the stars, a young Varani woman named Ree held her own children close and told them stories of the human who had waited in the rubble until trust could be born. And the children listened with wide eyes and learned that fear did not have to last forever, and that kindness was stronger than cruelty. and that some promises were made to be kept. The story passed from generation to generation and changed with each telling as stories do, but the heart of it remained the same. A raised hand had made a cub fearful, and a human had knelt and given her word, and that had made all the difference. The storm came without warning in the way that storms often did on worlds that had been wounded. Yuna heard the first crack of thunder and felt the shelter shake, and she was on her feet before the second crack came. The lights flickered once, and then twice, and then died entirely, and the emergency lighting kicked in with its harsh red glow that painted everything in the color of blood and fire. He screamed. The sound cut through the thunder, and Yuna moved toward her through the chaos of people stumbling in the dark, and equipment falling from shelves, and voices calling out in confusion and fear. She found Ri pressed into the corner of her cot with her paws over her ears and her eyes squeezed shut and her whole body shaking so hard that the cot rattled against the floor. "Ri," Yuna said, and she knelt beside the cot. "Ri, it is me, and it is Yuna, and you are safe." But the cub could not hear her over the storm in her mind, and the memories that the flashing lights and booming sounds had awakened. "Mother," Ri cried, and her voice was raw with a grief she had not allowed herself to feel. "Mother, please, and Mother, I'm scared, and please do not leave, and please." Yuna did not hesitate, and she did not ask permission. She gathered Ri into her arms and pulled the small trembling body against her chest and wrapped herself around the cub like a shield against everything that had hurt her and everything that still could. "I am here," she said, and her voice was low and steady, even as the storm raged outside and the shelter groaned under the wind. "I am here, and I have you, and nothing will hurt you." Ri struggled at first, and her body remembered the hands that had grabbed and struck and killed, and she pushed against Yuna with all her small strength. But Yuna did not let go and did not squeeze tighter, and simply held on with gentle firmness and began to hum. Melody was old, and her grandmother had taught it to her when she was small and afraid of the dark, and it had no words that Ri could understand, but music does not need words to speak. The sound vibrated through Yuna's chest and into Ri's body, and the cub's struggle slowed, and then stopped, and then her small paws reached up and grabbed fistfuls of Yuna's uniform and held on like she was the only solid thing in a universe that kept trying to shake. Apart, they stayed that way through the worst of the storm, and Yuna rocked gently and hummed a lullaby over and over and felt Ri's breathing slowly match the rhythm of the song. The thunder moved away eventually, and the wind died down, and the emergency lights stopped flickering and settled into a steady glow. Ri had not let go. "I dreamed about her," the cub whispered against Yuna's chest, and her voice was hoarse from screaming. "I dreamed about my mother, and she was telling me to run, but I could not move, and they were coming, and she stood in front of me, and you do not have to tell me," Yuna said softly. "I want to," Ri replied, and the words came slowly like they were being pulled from somewhere deep. "I want to tell someone, and I want someone to know what she did and what she gave." So Yuna listened as Ri told her about the morning the Kef came, and how her father had gone to meet them and tried to talk, and how the talking had turned to shooting, and how her mother had grabbed Ri and hidden her in the space beneath the floor. She listened as Ri described her brother running out the back and drawing the raiders away from their hiding spot and never coming back. She listened as Ri told her how her mother had covered her with her own body when the ceiling started to fall, and how the last thing she heard was her mother's voice saying her name when Ri finished her story. Yuna's face was wet with tears. She had not tried to stop, and she held the cub tighter and did not offer empty words about things being okay. "Your mother loved you," Yuna said finally, and that was all she said, because it was the truest thing and the only thing that mattered. Alarm blared through the shelter, and Yuna's head snapped up as Lieutenant Juan burst through the door with fear and anger fighting for control of his face. "Keth scouts detected at the system edge," he said. and his voice was sharp with urgency. All coalition personnel are ordered to evacuation shuttles immediately. Yuna did not move from where she knelt with Ree in her arms. What about the survivors? Not our jurisdiction, Juan replied, and he was already moving toward the door. Varani military will handle their own people, and we need to go now. I am not leaving. Juan stopped and turned and looked at Yuna like she had spoken a language he did not understand. Sergeant, that is a direct order, and I am refusing it. The silence that followed was heavy with shock, and Yuna could feel the eyes of everyone in the shelter. Turning toward them, Juan strode toward her, and his hand reached down toward Ree as if to pull the cub from her arms. And force the Ishuan's hand shot up and caught his wrist, and the speed of her movement made Juan's eyes go wide. She was not a large woman, and Juan had 40 pounds on her at least, but her grip was iron, and her eyes were harder still. She has my word, Yuna said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried through the shelter like the thunder had carried moments ago. We do not leave. You cannot be serious, Juan said, and he tried to pull free and found that he could not. I have never been more serious about anything in my life. Commander Torvik appeared at the shelter entrance and took in the scene with quick eyes and understood immediately what was happening. Lieutenant, he said, and his voice was calm. The Coalition Battle Group has arrived in response to our distress call, and the Keth Scouts are withdrawing. Juan's shoulders dropped slightly, but his eyes stayed on Yuna with a mix of frustration and something that might have been reluctant respect. You would have stayed, he said, and it was not quite a question. Yes, even if the Keth had come. Yes. Juan looked at Ree, who still clung to Yuna's uniform, and who was watching this exchange with wide eyes that held no fear for the first time since the storm began. A human had put herself between danger and a child that was not her own, and the human had not flinched. You are insane, Juan said finally, but there was no heat in the words. Maybe. Yuna agreed, and she released his wrist. But I gave my word. Juan shook his head and walked away, and Torvik watched him go before turning back to Yuna and the cub. Your species confuses me, the commander said. We confuse ourselves sometimes. Yuna Dmitrivek made a sound that might have been a laugh if his people laughed the way humans did. I am beginning to understand what your word means to you, he said, and his eyes moved. To Ree, I'm beginning to see why she trusts you. He laughed without waiting for a response, and Yuna looked down at Ree, who was still holding tight to her uniform. Are you okay? Yuna asked softly. Ree nodded against her chest. You stayed. I said I would. The other human wanted to leave, and you stopped him and you stayed. Yes. Ree was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that made Yuna's heart swell until it felt too big for her chest. My mother would have liked you. Yuna closed her eyes and held the cub and let the tears fall again, and did not try to stop them because some tears are meant to be shed. The medical shelter had been set up in what remained of a school building, and the walls still held drawings that Velani children had made before the world broke apart. Yuna looked at those drawings sometimes when Ree was sleeping, and she wondered about the small hands that had created them, and whether those hands had survived. 5 days had passed since Ree had told Yuna her name, and in that time the cub had emerged from the rubble and followed Yuna to the shelter and refused to be treated by anyone else. The Orjin Kang had arrived on the 3rd day with her gentle manner and her expertise in helping minds heal across the boundaries of species. She sat with Yuna now in a corner of the shelter, while Ree slept on a cot nearby with her small body curled into a tight ball. The Velrani officials want to transfer her to a processing center, Seojin said, and her voice was low enough that it would not wake the sleeping child. She has extended family on another world, and they are prepared to take her. Yuna looked at Ree and watched the small ears twitch in whatever dreams the cub was having. She is not ready. I agree, Seojin said, and she followed Yuna's gaze to the sleeping figure. But the officials do not understand why we cannot simply move her, and they see it as inefficiency rather than necessity. Then help me explain it to them. Seo-jin nodded slowly, and Yuna could see her organizing her thoughts in the careful way she always did when preparing to bridge the gap between human understanding and alien confusion. Among humans, we know that trauma creates bonds. Seo-jin said, when someone is hurt deeply and another person helps them through that hurt, they become connected in a way that cannot be rushed or forced. Ri chose me, Yuna said, and she did not say it with pride, but with the weight of responsibility. She felt she chose to trust me when trust was the hardest thing in the universe for her to give. And breaking that trust now could damage her in ways that might never heal. They sat in silence for a moment and watched. Ri sleep and Yuna thought about all the small steps that had brought them to this place. The first time, Ri had eaten the bland ration bar that Yuna offered without flinching away. The first time Ri had laughed at the silly game Yuna invented with stacking medical supply containers. The first time Ri had reached out and touched Yuna's hand with one small paw before pulling back like she had touched something. Hot Yuna had not reacted to that touch and had not grabbed the small paw or tried to hold it and had simply smiled and kept talking about nothing important. That moment had mattered more than Yuna could explain. Ri stirred on the cot, and her eyes opened slowly and found Yuna immediately, as they always did when she woke. You are still here, Ri said, and it was not a question, but a confirmation of something she needed to verify each time. I am still here, Yuna replied, and she moved to sit on the floor beside the cot so that Ri could see her clearly. I told you I would not leave until you were safe. Am I safe now? The question was simple, but the answer was complicated, and Yuna chose her words with care. You are safer than you were, and you will be safer still, and I will stay until safe means something you can feel and not just something I tell you. Ri was quiet for a moment, and then she sat up on the cot and looked at Yuna with those amber eyes that had seen too much. Will you tell me about the river again? Yuna smiled and began the story once more and added new details she had not mentioned before about the color of the water and autumn and the sound it made over the rocks and the way her niece would stand very still and listen for the voices in the stone estuary, listened with her ears tilted forward and her eyes half closed. Somewhere in the rhythm of the words, she found something that felt like Peace Commander Torvik came to the shelter that evening, and he stood in the doorway and watched Yuna teaching Ri to draw pictures in the dust with her finger. The cub was making shapes that might have been her family home before it fell, and Yuna made sounds of interest and encouragement without pushing for explanations. The officials have agreed to delay the transfer, Torvik said, and his voice was quieter than it had been in the ruins. Yuna looked up at him and nodded her thanks. Dr. Kang explained certain human concepts to them. Torvik continued, and he moved closer but slowly and carefully in a way that Yuna noticed. She spoke of attachment and trust, and the damage that comes from breaking bonds before they are ready to release. Did they understand? They understood enough to grant more time. Torvik looked at Ri, who had stopped drawing and was watching him with wary eyes. I have been observing, the commander said, and he directed his words at both of them now. I have been writing reports on human behavior during this relief operation, and I confess I do not understand what I am seeing. What do you see? Yuna asked. I see your people move slowly when speed seems necessary, and I see them focus on single individuals when there are many who need help, and I see them do things that make no sense to my training. He paused, and his ears flicked back and forth. And yet the survivors your people have helped are doing better than those processed through standard protocols, and I do not understand why. Yuna considered his words and tried to find a way to explain something that felt so natural to her. We believe that how you save someone matters as much as whether you save them, she said finally. A life pulled from the wreckage is not truly saved if the spirit inside that life remains broken. Torvik was silent for a long moment, and Una could see him turning this idea over in his mind like a strange object he had never seen before. He spoke into the silence, and her small voice carried more strength than it had days ago. She kept her word. The commander looked at the cub and waited for her to continue. She said she would not touch me until I allowed it, and she did not, and she said she would not leave me, and she has not, and her word means something. Torvik looked from the cub to the human, and something shifted in his expression. Perhaps, he said slowly, and his voice held a new note of something that might have been respect. Perhaps your people understand things about saving lives that we have not learned yet. He left the shelter without another word, and Una watched him go and then turned back to Rith. Cub was looking at her with those amber eyes that seemed less haunted than they had been, and one small paw was extended toward Una's hand. You can, Rhi said softly, and those two words meant more than any speech could have. Una took the small paw gently in her own hand and held it, without squeezing, and felt the trembling warmth of trust given freely. Thank you, Rhi, she said, and her voice caught slightly on the words. They sat together in the fading light and held hands and did not need to speak, because sometimes silence says everything that matters. The smoke had not stopped rising for 3 days. Sergeant Una Park stood at the edge of what had once been a residential district and watched the gray clouds twist toward a pale orange sky that seemed wrong somehow, too bright for a world that had suffered so much. The Velrani colony of Threshold 7 had been home to 40,000 souls before the Keth Dominion came, with fire and cruelty, and left nothing but ash and silence behind them. Now the coalition relief ships filled the landing zones, and humans in medical uniforms spread across the ruins like careful insects searching for any sign of life beneath the rubble. Una had seen this before on other worlds and in other systems where the Keth had passed through like a storm that cared nothing for the lives it destroyed. She carried her medical pack over one shoulder and walked slowly through streets that were no longer streets, but canyons of broken stone and twisted metal. Her team had been assigned to the eastern sector, where the family dwellings had clustered together in the Velrani tradition of community and shared walls. Most of those walls had fallen now. Commander Torvik of the Velrani military walked beside her with his tall frame bent slightly, as if the weight of what he saw pressed down upon his shoulders. His fur was dark gray with streaks of white around his muzzle, and his large ears turned constantly toward every sound, as if he expected the raiders to return at any moment. Your people move slowly, he said to Una without looking at her. We move carefully, she replied, and kept her voice neutral, because she understood that his frustration came from grief and not from any real complaint about her team. The Keth took 3 hours to destroy what my people built over generations, Torvik continued, and his voice carried a sharp edge that Una recognized as barely controlled rage. Careful takes longer than cruel, Una said simply. Torvik made a sound in his throat that might have been agreement or might have been dismissal, and Una did not ask which. They walked in silence after that, through the broken bones of a neighborhood that had once held families and laughter and all the small ordinary moments that made life worth living. Una's scanner picked up a faint biosign near a collapsed dwelling, and she raised her hand to signal her team to stop. The reading was weak but present, and it came from beneath a pile of beams and shattered stone that had once been a home. Survivor, she said quietly, and moved toward the rubble with careful steps. Her team followed, and they began the slow work of moving debris, piece by piece, so they would not cause further collapse and harm whoever lay beneath. Una reached a gap in the wreckage and shone her light into the darkness below. 2 eyes reflected back at her, and they were wide with terror and rimmed with the amber color that marked the Velrani species. A cub, the small figure pressed against the far corner of a tiny pocket that had formed when the ceiling fell, and the child could not have been more than 6 cycles old, which Una knew was roughly equal to an 8-year-old human. The cub's fur was matted with dust and dried blood, and her ears lay flat against her skull. In the universal posture of fear. "Hello there," Yuna said softly, and she raised her hand slowly to push aside a beam that blocked her path. The cub screamed. The sound tore through the quiet ruins, and Yuna froze with her hands still raised in the air as the small Velruna child pressed herself harder against the stone and covered her face with trembling paws. Yuna understood immediately. A raised hand had been the last thing this child saw before her world ended, and before the Keth brought down their weapons upon everything she loved. Yuna lowered her hand very slowly, and then she did something that made Commander Tarvik stare at her with confusion. She knelt, not just crouched or bent down, but actually knelt on the broken stone with both knees pressing into the rubble until she was as low as she could make herself. "I am not going to hurt you," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. The cub did not move and did not lower her paws from her face. Yuna stayed where she was and made no attempt to reach into the gap or pull the child out or do any of the efficient practical things that her training told her would save time. One of her team members stepped forward and spoke in a low voice near her ear. "Sergeant, we have other sectors to cover, and we cannot spend hours on one survivor when there might be others." "Then cover them," Yuna replied without turning her head away from the cub. "But protocol says—" "I know what protocol says," Yuna interrupted gently but firmly, and something in her tone made the team members step back without another word. Commander Tarvik moved closer and looked down at the human woman kneeling in the dirt, and then at the terrified cub who had not moved from her corner. "What are you doing?" he asked, and his voice held genuine confusion rather than criticism. "Waiting," Yuna said. "For what?" "For her to see that I am not what hurt her." Torvik's ears flicked back and forth as he processed this answer, and Yuna could tell that he did not fully understand, but he did not order her to move either. The minutes passed slowly in that ruined place, and Yuna felt the stone dig into her knees, and the dust settle on her uniform, and the weight of the cub's fear pressing against her heart like something physical. She did not speak again or reach toward the child or make any move that could be seen as a threat. She simply existed there in that space as something other than danger and something other than the raised hands that had brought destruction. The cub's breathing slowed gradually from the rapid, desperate gasps of panic to something closer to normal, and her paws lowered just slightly from her face so that one amber eye could peer out at the strange creature that knelt before. Harina met that gaze and smiled very softly and did not move. The cub's ear twitched once and then twice, and that tiny movement was the first sign that the wall of terror might have the smallest crack in it. Commander Torvik watched this silent exchange, and something shifted in his expression, though Yuna could not spare the attention to identify what it was. Her whole focus remained on the child in the darkness and on the simple truth she was trying to communicate without words. "I am here, and I will not hurt you, and I will wait for as long as you need me to wait." The orange sky above them slowly darkened toward evening, and still Yuna knelt, and still the cub watched, and somewhere in the space between them a fragile thread of something that was not quite trust, but might one day become trust began to form in the dust and silence of a broken world.